Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most staggering, whiplash-inducing turnarounds in all of military history. We're looking at the Kraśnik Tarnawka Axis of 1914. I mean, think about this. In just 14 days, literally 2 weeks, the Austro-Hungarian forces went from celebrating this massive, sweeping victory to suffering a totally chaotic, devastating collapse. We're going to unpack exactly how that happened, starting from the grand strategy all the way down to the brutal, forensic realities left behind on the battlefield.
Okay, let's dive into this. There's a really haunting quote from the Polish historical dossiers that details the aftermath of this exact campaign, and it goes like this. And sometimes you will find graves in the sand that no one knows. I really want to ground us right away in the human reality of this campaign. You know, we're not just talking about lines moving on a map here. This was an industrial meat grinder. It swallowed entire regiments made up of multi-ethnic citizens from fallen empires, and it left a footprint that, honestly, we are still uncovering today.
Part 1. The Austro-Hungarian Advance, the initial momentum.
The sheer speed of this campaign's rise and fall is it's incredible. Let's trace this timeline. Right between August 23rd and 25th, you've got these initial huge victories at Kraśnik. But fast forward barely 2 weeks to September 10th, those exact same victorious armies are in a desperate, chaotic retreat across the 10A River. It just goes to show how quickly, and I mean absolutely completely, an army can disintegrate when operational logistics fail.
So here's how it started. General Viktor Denkel's First Army made this aggressive, preemptive advance north into Russian Poland. The Austro-Hungarian chief of the general staff ordered this to disrupt Russian mobilization, and, well, at first, it worked perfectly. Denkel's forces slammed into the Russian 14th Army Corps near Kraśnik and just completely routed them. It was a massive tactical victory. They secured the area, drove the defenders back, and scooped up a staggering 6,000 Russian prisoners. At this point, the optimism in the Austro-Hungarian ranks was absolutely sky high.
Part 2. A fatal 50-mile gap. Operational collapse.
Now, what's really interesting here is the immediate command shift the Russians made right after they lost at Kraśnik. The Russian High Command, Stavka, realized they were in full-blown crisis mode, so they fired their failing commander, Baron Anton von Salza, who had been running a totally disjointed offensive, and they brought in General Alexei Everett. Everett was a Russo-Japanese war veteran and, crucially, a methodical artillery expert. His mandate was incredibly clear: stop advancing blindly, anchor the army on high ground, and set up a heavily fortified attrition-based defense.
But as Everett is digging in and fortifying his lines, the Austro-Hungarians make a totally fatal error. 50 miles. They left a massive 50-mile gap completely undefended. The Austro-Hungarian Fourth Army, which was supposed to be guarding General Dankel's eastern flank, got ordered to pivot south toward Lenneberg to relieve pressure over there. So they just marched away. They left nothing but some minor cavalry and Landstrom detachments to cover this enormous 50-mile void.
And let me tell you, the Russians absolutely did not miss their chance. After pulling off a tactical withdrawal of his own, Russian General Pavel von Plevwe ruthlessly reorganized his Fifth Army and pointed them straight into that 50-mile void. His columns completely bypassed those weak eastern security detachments and drove right into Dankel's rear areas. It was a brilliant maneuver. Plevwe totally outflanked the victorious Austro-Hungarian First Army, threatening to just sever their supply lines and wrap them up entirely.
Part 3. The Tarnawka Artillery Trap, a deadly defensive line.
Okay, remember General Uvert, the methodical artillery expert we talked about? Well, he systematically turned the elevated terrain of Tarnawka into a literal meat grinder. He deployed the 3rd Heavy Artillery Brigade with just devastating precision. Look at this setup. He put 152mm howitzers on reverse slopes, so indirect fire to just obliterate field fortifications. Then, he used 107mm guns to rain shrapnel down over the open agricultural fields. And finally, he tucked 76.2mm divisional guns into fortified spots for rapid, direct fire. He essentially pre-registered every single inch of the Austro-Hungarian approach.
To really wrap your head around the scale of this bombardment, just think about this number: 40,000. In just 72 hours of non-stop combat at Tarnawka, those Russian batteries dumped 40,000 rounds of 76.2mm ammunition, plus another 12,000 to 15,000 heavy shells right onto the attacking Central Powers. It created an absolute impassable wall of fragmentation and high explosives.
Part 4. Bayonets against heavy guns, the human cost.
And this brilliantly illustrates the lethal absurdity of military command back in 1914. Faced with Everett's brutal defensive line, the Austro-Hungarian and German commanders didn't pull back. Actually, they did the exact opposite. They launched repeated frontal bayonet assaults straight into those pre-registered 152mm heavy howitzers. No adequate counter-battery fire to protect their guys, nothing. They just ordered infantry to literally climb the open slopes of the Tarnawka Heights, right into enfilade machine gun and heavy artillery crossfire.
The reality on the ground was just terrifying. There's a primary combat log from the advancing infantry that brings the horror of the Tarnawka forest right to us. It reads, "Saber and bayonet combat raged in that unfortunate forest for 8 continuous hours. We were confronted by elite Russian cadres, and as the artillery fire intensified, the forest was literally sheared apart by heavy shells, leaving our ranks entirely fragmented. Command and control? It vanished instantly in that dense undergrowth."
The granular casualty metrics from these assaults are just staggering. I mean, entire regiments simply ceased to exist. Take the German 4th Landwehr, mostly older Silesian reserves. They were reduced to a single combat battalion. Or look at the Austro-Hungarian Infantry Regiment 30. This was an incredibly multi-ethnic unit, about 70% ethnic Ukrainians and 30% Poles, and they suffered massive 50% losses. And as the retreat finally started, a lot of these multi-ethnic Slavic units saw huge rates of surrender. They realized they were dying for an empire that was essentially marching them straight into a meat grinder.
Part 5. The Forensic Footprint. Modern Landscape Scars.
We really have to pause on this solemn figure for a second. 15,000. Just in the sector between Kraśnik and Tarnawka alone, an estimated 15,000 Austro-Hungarian and German soldiers were officially listed as missing in action. The Russian heavy artillery was so intense, it didn't just kill, it fragmented remains and completely collapsed the trench systems. It buried men alive and left thousands totally unidentifiable.
Let's see how this horrific reality built the physical landscape that we still see today. Because of the sheer volume of bodies, combined with the rapid retreat of the Central Powers, the victorious Russian sanitary details had to manage the dead incredibly fast. So what did they do? They dug massive, unmarked trenches right into the agricultural fields and forested valleys. They just buried thousands of multinational casualties right into the very ground they fell on, entirely without individual markers.
If you go visit the Tarnawka Military Cemetery today, the layout actually tells the forensic story of those 72 hours. It sits up on a prominent elevation surrounded by open agricultural fields, laid out in a 100-meter square. And it's surrounded by this large earth rampart. That embankment was actually built by Austro-Hungarian forces when they eventually came back in 1915, trying to secure those undocumented mass graves. Inside that rampart, 6,000 soldiers are buried in collective graves. But what's really interesting is that the forensic distribution is highly segregated. Russian dead were buried closer to a neighboring village, while the Austro-Hungarian and German casualties were concentrated precisely on the Tarnawka Heights, exactly where they fell while charging the guns.
It all leads us to this final, provocative thought I want to leave you with today. How exactly does a modern, quiet agricultural landscape silently swallow the multi-ethnic armies of fallen empires in just 14 days? The story of the Kraśnik Tarnawka axis is a really stark reminder that beneath the surface of the world we walk on right now, the brutal, rapid shifts of early 20th century history are still hidden in plain sight. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.